The body of another Kenyan was flown into the country from Saudi Arabia.
Beaten, tortured, others sexually assaulted. A plea for help by a group of Kenyan women at a Saudi deportation center.
Kafiri wangu alisema amenifunga. Sasa amesema siwezi toka hapa kama sijampatia pesa yake.
I am pleased to inform that the agreement of recruitment of domestic workers was successfully signed.
Saudi Arabia, going there, it's like you're signing your own death, because it's a death trap.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Krishnan Guru-Murthy from Channel 4. We just heard Jeffrey Goldberg talking about great stories. And we've got a good case study now of a great story, and it's going to take your focus away from Trump and America and into the Middle East and Africa. Because joining me now are two incredibly tenacious journalists from the New York Times, Abdi Latif Dahir and Justin Scheck. Now, this was an incredible story about abuse and exploitation. How did you get it off the ground? What drew you to it, first of all?
So a few years ago, the Kenyan government put out a statistic essentially saying that 89 domestic workers had died in Saudi Arabia. Majority of them were young women. And this was a data that they had never published before. And one of the things that stood out for us was also essentially how, they said that these women died of cardiac arrest, they died of suicide, which was, again, another anomaly. It's like, why are these young people dying in the span of 2 years? And so essentially we decided that we were going to take that data and investigate. Yet, across the East Africa, these stories of domestic workers going to the Middle East and facing abuse was very pervasive. But one of the things that we wanted to do was, get ambitious with the story and essentially try and say, look into why is it that there's a huge inflow of domestic workers going to the Middle East? Why is it that the governments, despite these statistics that they're releasing, continue to let these young people go to the Middle East? And also try and see if there was a possibility of looking into also, are there people who are powerful, politicians, wealthy business people who are profiting from this? So that's how it sort of essentially came together in the beginning.
Right, so when you started looking into the data, what did you start seeing? And what was the role division?
Well, so Abdi is based in Nairobi and is one of our East Africa correspondents. I'm based in London and do investigations, and I tend to write about money. And so we started talking, and I wrote about Saudi Arabia for years, and this is not a new issue, and The Guardian has done great work on this issue, as have a lot of local media in Kenya and Uganda. But the thing that really struck me about it was Saudi Arabia is changing so quickly. It's an autocracy. There's one guy who can change laws or law enforcement overnight and has done it many times. Why is this persistent? And the reason that's given in a lot of the coverage is the archaic Saudi labor laws, this sort of nebulous thing, which seemed really bogus because it's a country that can very quickly change its laws. So what we started looking into was who's making money on the system as it is now, who makes money in a system that doesn't have any protections for the women. And we looking at corporate records and kind of talking to sources and pulling as much public information as we could, we sort of figured out who the ownership structures of these companies and their relationships to government officials.
Right, so how easy was it to get the story off the ground and commissioned? I mean, this is sort of totally off normal agenda. The world's attention is all facing one way. And this is it's not an unreported story, but it's a story that's hard to get people's attention for.
Yeah, I think from the minute, we approached the editors, I think they were very, very interested. I think the big question was only, just as I said, how ambitious could we get with it? And also, how are we going to connect the dots in the sense of, are we going to, finding the companies was part of the story, and then finding those companies and their links to these politicians and the Saudi royals was another part of the story. And then again, linking, those companies and these politicians to like actually cases of abuse, like domestic workers who had actually gone with these companies and who were lured and were abused throughout the entire process from leaving East Africa into Saudi Arabia. I think there was interest from the editors from the get-go, but I think the big thing that we had was connecting all these dots and actually, producing a story that linked all of these aspects together.
I mean, it's an expensive story to do.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that Joe kind of alluded to earlier. We are incredibly privileged to work at a place that's independent, a place that is open to stories like this that are completely off the beaten track, and that has, it's a healthy enough organization financially that we didn't feel any pressure to spend less money than we needed to. And that's something that every day I think about and we talk about, and the story was expensive. We had to make repeated trips to rural parts of Kenya and Uganda that are incredibly inconvenient, and everything takes longer than you want it to. And if we didn't get what we needed, we were able to go back and go back and go back. And that's something that we're very lucky to have. But I will say, we were going over some of the reader data. The story was the most read story in the international section for the first quarter of the year. And so I think that investment is somewhat vindicated by the fact that people read this kind of stuff. We got great promotion. The Times really does a good job of disseminating the stories and making people read them. And so it's not like the money that was invested in the story was simply charity. It's a legitimate. People read the story.
Yeah, people watched it.
Yeah.
So when you're getting into sort of case studies, let's talk about the Isiko Moses family. What happened? Where was that pointing you towards the bigger story?
So this is one of the ones, one of the people who, or one of the cases I reported in Uganda, where a woman named Aisha Mimi had been, like so many other women, to support her family, to make some money. She went to Saudi Arabia to work, expected to be there for a couple of years, and very quickly the situation sort of spiraled. She was abused. She was reporting back to her husband and her family that she was being abused, and then kind of went silent, and the husband finds out that she died. So he starts trying to find information, like A, what happened, B, what happened to the money she was owed, and C, can he get her body back to bury her in Uganda? And finds himself in this morass that a lot of the families told us about, where nobody's really accountable for any of it. They finally get an autopsy from Saudi Arabia that shows she's covered in burns, broken ribs, covered in bruises, and the cause of death is natural causes. So there's no police investigation that we could find out about. We didn't get much of a response. There's no legal follow-up, so everything is kind of done person to person, and so the employer says, well, I could pay you the money we owed her, or I can pay to have her body sent back to Uganda. And so Isiko was like, well, I want to bury my wife in Uganda, so he chose to take the body of his wife, and he said he wanted his kids to be present to see what happened to their mother, and ended up with no money, and his wife is dead, and there's no accountability along the chain. The chain is a Ugandan company that recruited her, a Saudi company that then placed her with an employer, and the employer themselves.
So what does that start to tell you about the power structures you're up against? I mean, first of all, in Saudi Arabia, because there's both Saudi Arabia and East African stuff, but they're quite different in terms of what you're up against. So what did that start pointing you towards?
I think the big theme that story and many of the others showed was that there was a systematic way in which these deaths were happening. The abuse happens, and there's a system, particularly in East Africa and in Saudi Arabia, that is covering up this abuse. So a lot of these young women who are getting lured from these villages, from these areas, shanty towns in the main cities, and basically sometimes their documentation is getting falsified. They're taken through this process. They're signing contracts, sometimes in Arabic, while they are at the airport in Nairobi or Kampala, about to go to Saudi Arabia. And then once abuse happens to them in Saudi Arabia, they get abused, they get assaulted, they die, they're thrown off roofs of balconies. And essentially the Saudi system also covers up like what happens to them. So there's no documentation to follow up actually what happened. Sometimes, the autopsies, just as Justin said, read completely different things. Sometimes two different Saudi agencies, the documentations that we got would, the Minister of Interior would say something, the police would say something, and the Minister of Health would say something else. And all these documents are getting issued separately, but once we had all of them together and we saw that, it wasn't just one case, and it wasn't just one, dozens of cases, not just in Kenya, but also in Uganda and many other places. So it showed that there's a level of cover-up and abuse that was happening that was very, very systematic.
And how high up does it go in Saudi Arabia?
I mean, that's always the question in Saudi Arabia, because it's a place.
And everything goes to the top.
Yeah, everything goes to the top. And if everything doesn't go to the top, it goes to these layers of people who are afraid of the person at the top. So, in Saudi Arabia, it's a complicated situation because on the one hand, it's an autocratic state. On the other hand, the leadership needs some buy-in from people so that they don't start protesting or becoming otherwise problematic. And one of the things the Saudi state allows its people to have is super cheap domestic labor. And so anything that the government were to do to make it more expensive to have a maid, like a minimum wage or restrictions on how much they can work or putting people in jail when they beat their maids, that comes at a cost to the leadership, number one. And number two, there are powerful people who wrote about government officials who have leadership roles at the biggest recruiting companies in the country. So the interests of those businesses have a direct line into the royal court and to the government. So I think it's a combination of why change the system that the people like and why mess with the system that powerful people are benefiting from.
And how difficult is it to find anything else in Saudi Arabia? And how did you sort of work together to try and find the truth?
It's annoying, but we found out a lot. You can always find stuff out. I mean, that's what we're paid full time to find stuff out. So we do. But it was, a lot of times you follow the route of what information is available. So I'm sure there are better stories that we just didn't know about, but a lot of, the people who are going from Kenya and Uganda, by and large, are they're educated. These are not ignorant people who are surprised by the risks. They know exactly what the risks are.
But it's not a system that is used to being held to account by journalists.
But what I'm saying is they keep documentation. So many of the women we interviewed, or their families, had documentation on the employers and the companies they worked for with phone numbers. Abdi speaks Arabic, and Abdi is completely fearless when it comes to confronting people. And so he got on the phone with a lot of people who may or may not have beaten their maids to death and asked them about it. And so it was doable.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the thing that was interesting, particularly about the Uganda-Kenya stuff in terms of finding documentation, what really surprised me was that once we had these lawmakers, that either the domestic workers or through other documentation, people were I went with this company and I think the person who signed on my contract was this lawmaker. It was only a matter of time that that we were able to dig that, but it took a bit of time in terms of confirming company ownership, going into the public records. I wouldn't get into the weeds of it, but in Kenya and both in Uganda, there are a bit of complications with the business registration office and how they give information. And so we eventually were able to get those documents. And once we found those documents, it was very interesting that many of them were still had the names of these lawmakers, even though it was in the public domain that many politicians still own companies. Even as late as last night, the Kenyan Senate summoned the Minister of Labor, there's another ongoing case right now of young people who are the government agencies and other recruitment agencies solicited money from, and with a promise of going to the Middle East to get jobs. So this is an ongoing crisis in Kenya.
And the women themselves face obstacles from the Kenyan authorities. In terms of sort of exploitation, sort of an old story, but also in terms of sort of the culture and their own families. Tell us a little bit about Esther.
Esther is an example of how young women and young people in Kenya and East Africa are incredibly ambitious. She comes from Western Kenya. She decided that she was going to go to Saudi Arabia because she wanted to work and sort of help with her father's medical bills. Her father was incredibly sick a few years ago. And she was recruited by, again, like the way the system is made is that these recruitment agencies go all the way down to the villages, and sometimes they use the most trusted person in the community. So she was recruited by the pastor in the village, and who essentially was like, there's this opportunity. So by the mere fact that he delivers her to this recruitment agency, he earns money as a broker. So she finds herself in Nairobi. Her documents were falsified. She signed her contract at the airport. Half of the contract was in Arabic, which she couldn't read or understand. And she lands in Saudi Arabia, goes through like 2 years of hell, going from one employer to the other, getting abused. But the interesting thing about her story is that she eventually was able to get out and come back to Kenya. And just to show that, the abuse that these women face is, it's not just about happening in Kenya or Saudi Arabia, it also happens in the homes that they're living in. So she comes back, and I remember when we were doing this interview, it was the most surprising thing, like 40 minutes into the interview, she, her mother was sitting there, her father had since deceased, but the uncle was, sitting in there with us, basically domineering the conversation and sort of like asking her to like answer questions and whatnot. And she just, at 40 minutes through into the conversation, she got relaxed and started talking and started crying. And she basically looked at him and she's like, I went through all this hell in Saudi Arabia and you beating me? Like, why do you beat me? And so she's turned to the uncle, and for the first time, 2 years since she came back, was able to actually ask him that question. So the abuse,
incredibly brave.
Yeah, doesn't end even when they come back.
Now, as you say, the stories had, a huge readership. In terms of impact, what has happened?
Well, the only feedback we've gotten from the Saudis is that the spokesman for the government got really upset that we used his name in the story. Very upset. We haven't heard anything, but that's not unusual. And I've written about Saudi Arabia on and off for many years. And the government has a tendency to respond to these things, but they don't want to look like they're responding to pressure, to what they view as outward pressure. So they have been making efforts to improve the systems for regulating migrant labor. Like, it's very slow moving. We haven't really seen much. I think in Kenya and Uganda, there's this really robust, there's like a lot of really robust local journalism that have been making hay with this. And I think when we wrote stories that connected this business directly to high-profile politicians, they kind of jumped on it. And Abdi could speak more to that.
Yeah, the story was picked up in Kenya, it was picked up in Uganda. There's a lot of discussion around it. Human rights groups, particularly, and activists have been using it. There's a lot of discontent with, both governments, particularly in Kenya right now. But the ultimate thing is that, just as I said, is that the government continues to behave as if this is not a major issue. And they, as late as last night, right, like this is a debate that is ongoing about why is it that young people continue to go to the Middle East and continue to go to Saudi Arabia, even though they continue to die there, face abuse, and the government continues to send them. So it's a story that we're still looking into, but yeah, the governments are basically pretending that this is not a problem.
Well, congratulations. Keep going. Abdi and Justin for the New York Times. Thank you.